You think you can fix it? The question echoed through the glass-walled engineering center, followed by laughter that rolled across the room like a wave. No one expected the janitor to answer. No one expected him to even look up. And absolutely no one imagined that the man holding a mop would soon become the center of a story that would leave an entire company in stunned silence. The headquarters of Sterling Velocity Group stood just outside Austin, Texas, a sprawling campus of steel, glass, and ambition. Engineers, executives, and investors moved through its corridors every day, building machines worth fortunes and chasing innovations that could change industries. But on that particular Thursday morning, nobody was talking about technology. They were talking about a car. Parked beneath a circle of bright showroom lights sat a crimson Ferrari unlike anything most people would ever see. Its paint gleamed like liquid fire. Its body was flawless. Yet for 5 long years, the machine had refused to run. More than $2 million had been spent trying to bring it back to life. Specialists had flown in from across the country. Consultants had come and gone. Teams had replaced parts, rewritten software, analyzed diagnostics, and exhausted every possible explanation. Nothing worked. The Ferrari remained silent. To Victoria Sterling, CEO of the company and owner of the vehicle, it represented the only problem she had never solved. 5 years, she said as she stood before a crowd of employees gathered in the main atrium. 5 years, $2 million, and nobody can tell me what's wrong with this car. The room remained quiet. Some employees shifted nervously. Others avoided eye contact. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew the Ferrari. Victoria crossed her arms. Her tailored navy suit looked as sharp as her reputation. At 38, she had built one of the fastest-growing automotive technology companies in America. She was known for solving impossible problems. But this one had beaten her. "So here's my offer," she announced. "Anyone who can make this Ferrari start today gets $1 million. A murmur swept through the crowd. Heads turned. Eyes widened. $1 million. Some laughed nervously. Others stared at the car as if seeing it for the first time. Then a voice spoke from the back. Quiet. Calm. Almost hesitant. "I think I know where I'd start." The room froze. Slowly, dozens of heads turned toward the source. Standing beside a cleaning cart was Ethan Brooks. 45 years old. Gray beginning to touch his temples. Blue work shirt. Name tag. Mop in one hand. He looked completely ordinary. Which was exactly why the laughter started. One engineer chuckled. Another smirked. Within seconds, the sound spread across the atrium. "The janitor?" someone whispered. "This should be good." Ethan lowered his eyes and said nothing more. He simply returned to wiping the polished floor. Victoria studied him. The amusement on her face lingered for a moment before curiosity replaced it. She stepped forward. "You think you know where to start?" Ethan glanced up. "Maybe." More laughter. Victoria raised a hand, silencing the room. Her eyes never left him. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow morning. Right here. In front of everyone. You get 30 minutes with the Ferrari." The crowd leaned in. The challenge hung in the air. "And if you can't fix it," someone called out. Victoria's gaze remained fixed on Ethan. "Then we all find out whether confidence and competence are the same thing." The room erupted again. But Ethan didn't react. He simply nodded once and returned to his work. And as the laughter echoed through the building, nobody noticed the way his eyes briefly settled on the Ferrari. Not with doubt, not with hope, but with the quiet recognition of a man looking at a mystery he had seen before. The challenge spread through Sterling Velocity Group faster than any corporate announcement ever could. By lunchtime, engineers were discussing it in conference rooms. By mid-afternoon, executives were whispering about it in glass offices overlooking the campus. By evening, employees who worked remotely had heard the story through text messages and private chats. The janitor was going to attempt what some of the most respected automotive minds in America had failed to accomplish. Most people thought it was ridiculous. A few thought it was entertaining. Almost nobody thought it was possible. Inside the private engineering wing, the Ferrari sat beneath bright white lights while a team of specialists prepared reports for the following morning. Diagnostic charts covered digital screens. Service records filled entire folders. Every repair attempt from the previous 5 years had been documented with obsessive detail. 43 separate evaluations, one engineer said while scrolling through a tablet. 7 complete electrical inspections. 3 engine teardowns. For software rebuilds. Another shook his head. and none of it changed anything. The first engineer laughed softly. But apparently the janitor knows something we do not. Several people around the table chuckled. The sound was not cruel. It was confident. They trusted credentials. They trusted experience. They trusted titles. And Ethan Brooks possessed none of those things. At least none that anyone could see. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the campus, Ethan pushed his cleaning cart through a quiet hallway. The building felt different now. People who had never noticed him before suddenly recognized him. Some smiled. Some smirked. Some simply stared. Ethan acknowledged none of it. He emptied trash bins, polished glass doors, and moved through the evening exactly as he always did. Quiet. Steady. Invisible. Near sunset, Victoria Sterling stood alone inside the showroom. The enormous windows reflected the orange Texas sky while long shadows stretched across the polished floor. Her eyes settled on the Ferrari. 5 years. She could still remember the day it arrived. The car had represented a dream, a masterpiece of engineering, something rare and extraordinary. Then it failed. The machine had become a puzzle she could never solve. And Victoria hated unsolved puzzles. She walked slowly around the vehicle. Every curve reflected the fading sunlight. Every detail looked perfect. Yet beneath that perfection lived a problem no one could find. Her phone vibrated. It was her chief engineer. "You really plan to let him try?" he asked. Victoria looked at the car. "Why not?" "Because he is a janitor. And all of you are experts." She replied calmly. Silence followed. The engineer cleared his throat. "That is different." Victoria smiled faintly. "Is it?" After ending the call, she remained beside the Ferrari for several minutes. Something about Ethan's confidence bothered her. Not because it seemed arrogant. Because it seemed absent of ego entirely. Most people who claimed they could solve impossible problems wanted attention. Ethan appeared to want nothing. That night, long after most employees had gone home, security cameras captured a final figure walking through the engineering center. Ethan paused near the Ferrari. He did not touch it. He did not open the door. He simply stood there in silence, studying it from a distance. The overhead lights reflected in his eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded to himself. Not like a man facing an impossible challenge. More like a man recognizing an old mistake that everyone else had overlooked. The next morning arrived with a pale Texas sunrise spilling across the glass walls of Sterling Velocity Group. While most of the city was still waking up, Ethan Brooks was already on the road. His aging pickup truck moved quietly through the early traffic, the heater humming softly against the cool morning air. Beside him sat a 12-year-old girl with a backpack on her lap and a science project tucked carefully between her feet. Lily Brooks smiled as she looked out the window. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Ethan glanced at her and returned a small smile. "About what?" "Everyone at work is talking about you." Ethan chuckled. "That sounds unfortunate." Lily laughed. "Dad, I am serious." "I know." She studied him for a moment. "Do you really think you can help?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Sometimes people spend so much time looking for complicated answers that they stop seeing simple ones. Lily nodded slowly. She had heard him say things like that before. Her father rarely talked about himself, but whenever she faced a problem at school, his advice always sounded simple until it turned out to be right. 20 minutes later, Ethan dropped her off in front of Willow Creek Middle School. Before climbing out, Lily paused. "Whatever happens today, I am proud of you." Ethan looked away briefly, as if the words carried more weight than she realized. "Have a good day, kiddo." She closed the door and waved as he drove away. For a few seconds, Ethan watched her in the rearview mirror. Then he continued toward work. By 8 o'clock, the engineering center felt more like an event venue than a workplace. Employees gathered around the Ferrari. Coffee cups steamed in nervous hands. Conversations bounced across the room. The atmosphere carried the energy of a championship game moments before kickoff. Victoria Sterling arrived precisely on time. Her presence immediately quieted the crowd. She stepped onto the showroom floor and surveyed the gathering. Engineers, executives, investors, department managers. Nearly everyone wanted to witness what happened next. Yet the person attracting the most attention had not even entered the room. "Maybe he changed his mind," one employee whispered. "Maybe he realized how ridiculous this is," another replied. A few people laughed. Then the showroom doors opened. Ethan walked in carrying a simple thermos and wearing the same blue maintenance uniform he wore every day. No dramatic entrance. No confidence display. No speech. He nodded politely to a receptionist who greeted him and continued toward the crowd. The room grew strangely quiet. Victoria watched him approach. "You came," she said. Ethan looked around. "I said I would. You understand what is at stake. A car that does not run." A few people smirked. Victoria crossed her arms. "Nothing more." Ethan glanced at the Ferrari. The bright lights reflected across its flawless bodywork. "Machines are honest," he said calmly. "They always tell you what is wrong. The hard part is learning how to listen." The room fell silent again. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. It was an unusual answer. Not technical, not impressive, yet somehow it sounded like something they should have understood. Victoria studied him carefully. For the first time since this strange challenge began, she found herself less interested in the Ferrari and more interested in the quiet man standing in front of it. Because while everyone else seemed eager to prove something, Ethan Brooks looked like a man who had nothing left to prove at all. Victoria glanced at the large clock mounted on the showroom wall. 30 minutes, she said. "That is what you asked for." Ethan nodded. "That is enough." A few engineers exchanged amused looks. One of them folded his arms. "We spent 5 years on this car." Another added, "You might want to spend the first 10 minutes reading the reports." Light laughter rippled through the crowd. Ethan did not respond. Instead, he walked slowly around the Ferrari. Once, then twice. His eyes moved across every curve, every panel gap, every detail that reflected the bright overhead lights. The room watched in silence. No laptop, no scanner, no diagnostic equipment, just observation. "What exactly is he doing?" someone whispered. "Wasting time," another replied. Ethan stopped beside the driver's side door. He crouched slightly and studied a section near the rear quarter panel. Then he stood and moved toward the front of the vehicle. The engineers looked increasingly confused. Victoria remained quiet. She had expected confidence or performance. Instead, she was watching patience. Several minutes passed. Ethan finally spoke. "Who approved the first repair?" The question surprised everyone. One engineer frowned. "The first repair? 5 years ago," Ethan said. "Who signed off on it?" The room grew still. A senior engineer stepped forward. "Why does that matter?" Ethan looked at him calmly. "Because every problem has a beginning." No one answered immediately. The engineer eventually pulled a tablet from a folder and checked old records. "Daniel Mercer," he said. "He retired 3 years ago." Ethan nodded slowly. "Was the car running before that repair?" "Yes." "And after?" The engineer hesitated. "No." A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan asked another question. "What was replaced?" "A control module." "Original factory part?" "No." "Custom performance upgrade?" Ethan nodded again. His expression did not change. Victoria noticed something unusual. Every question seemed simple, yet nobody else had asked them. The engineers had spent years analyzing symptoms. Ethan was searching for history. "You think the first repair caused everything?" Victoria asked. Ethan looked at the Ferrari. "I think people are often too quick to trust what they changed and too slow to question why they changed it." The showroom fell quiet. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. One younger engineer scoffed. "If the first repair was wrong, dozens of specialists would have caught it." Ethan met his gaze without irritation. Unless every specialist trusted the specialist before them. The young engineer opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The silence that followed felt uncomfortable. Ethan walked toward the vehicle again. "I need the complete modification records." "There are thousands of pages," someone said. "Then we should start reading." More confused looks spread through the room. The clock continued ticking. 22 minutes remained. Yet Ethan had not touched a single tool. He had not opened the engine compartment. He had not connected a diagnostic cable. To everyone watching, it looked as though he was doing nothing. But Victoria noticed something different. For the first time in 5 years, somebody was asking questions that made the experts nervous. And as the records were brought forward and old documents began to change hands, a strange feeling settled over the showroom. The Ferrari no longer seemed like the mystery. The mystery was the quiet janitor who somehow knew exactly where to begin. The showroom had fallen into a different kind of silence, the kind that no longer carried amusement or doubt, but something closer to discomfort. Ethan stood near the Ferrari with the thick stack of modification records now placed on a metal table beside him. The pages were heavy with annotations, timestamps, and signatures from specialists across multiple states. Engineers gathered behind him, watching closely as he turned each page with steady patience. Victoria remained a few steps away, her eyes fixed on him without blinking. "You are looking at paperwork instead of the car," one senior engineer finally said. Ethan did not look up. "The paperwork tells me what the car has been through," he replied calmly. "The car only tells me what it has survived." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Ethan continued reading. Minutes passed. Then he stopped. His finger rested on a line of text near the bottom of a page. "Here," he said quietly. The nearest engineer leaned in. "What is it?" Ethan pointed. "This modification was signed off during a full electrical recalibration." "Yes," the engineer replied. "That was part of the second repair cycle." Ethan nodded. "And who performed the recalibration?" The engineer checked the document again. "A subcontracted systems technician team." Ethan asked another question immediately. "And who supervised them?" Silence stretched across the group. The engineer scrolled further down the page. "No listed supervisor on site." A low murmur moved through the crowd. Victoria stepped closer. "Are you saying a missing supervisor is the issue?" Ethan finally looked up. "I am saying responsibility was never assigned to the right point in the system." One of the engineers scoffed softly. "It is a Ferrari. It has redundancy systems. One missing signature does not shut down a vehicle for 5 years." Ethan closed the folder gently. "Not missing," he said. "Misplaced." The word lingered in the air longer than expected. Ethan walked toward the Ferrari again. He placed his hand lightly on the side panel, not with familiarity, but with focus. "This car was not broken 5 years ago," he said. "It was misinformed." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Cars do not get misinformed." Ethan nodded. "They do when people assume the wrong system is responsible for communicating failure." A young engineer finally spoke. "That does not make sense." Ethan turned slightly toward him. "It does if a control unit was replaced without resetting the dependency map." The engineer hesitated. "Dependency map?" Ethan reached for a marker and walked to a nearby whiteboard. For the first time, he moved with urgency. Not fast, but precise. He drew a simple diagram of interconnected systems. Lines, nodes, and one central control pathway. "Every system in this vehicle communicates through a hierarchy," he said. "If you replace the wrong node, the rest of the system continues to operate under false assumptions." The room went completely silent again. Ethan circled one section on the board. "This is where it started." Victoria stepped closer. "You are saying a software conflict has been hiding for 5 years." Ethan shook his head. "I am saying it was never visible because everyone assumed the symptom was the cause." One of the senior engineers finally lowered his head slightly. "We ran full diagnostics." Ethan looked at him without judgment. "You ran diagnostics on the result, not the origin." The words hit harder than any argument. Victoria stared at the diagram, then at the Ferrari, then back at Ethan. Something in her expression changed. The amusement was gone. The skepticism was gone. What remained was attention. Real attention. "How long will it take you to prove this?" she asked quietly. Ethan placed the marker down. "Not long," he said. "If I am right, the system will tell us immediately." He turned back toward the car. And for the first time in 5 years, the entire room was no longer watching a failure. They were watching the possibility that they had been looking in the wrong direction all along. The whiteboard markers had barely cooled when Ethan stepped away from the diagram and walked directly toward the Ferrari. The entire room seemed to follow his movement without realizing it, as if everyone had collectively decided that nothing else mattered. Engineers who had been skeptical just minutes earlier now stood in uneasy silence. Victoria Sterling remained fixed near the center of the showroom, her arms slowly lowering from their crossed position as she watched him. Ethan placed both hands lightly on the edge of the Ferrari's hood, not opening it yet, simply feeling the surface as if it carried information the rest of the world had ignored. "Before we do anything else," he said calmly, "I need power restored to the primary diagnostic interface without routing it through the secondary control bridge." A technician frowned. "We already tried that configuration." Ethan nodded. "You tried it after the last modification layer was installed." The technician hesitated. "Yes." Ethan looked up. "That is the problem." A ripple of uncertainty moved through the group. Victoria stepped forward. "Slightly." "Explain." Ethan opened the Ferrari's service panel with deliberate care. Inside, the wiring and components were arranged with extreme precision, but his eyes moved past what was visible and focused on how the systems were layered. This vehicle was originally designed with a single unified control architecture, he said. Every major function communicates through a central logic sequence. He paused, then continued. 5 years ago, that architecture was partially replaced, not fully removed, just overwritten. One of the engineers shook his head. We replaced a failing module. Ethan replied without looking away from the system. You replaced a module without recalibrating the communication hierarchy. The room grew quieter. Ethan pointed gently toward a cluster of connectors. This section is still operating under the original factory protocol while receiving input from a modified external system. That conflict does not always produce an immediate failure. Sometimes it produces silence. Victoria's expression tightened slightly. You are saying the car was never fully compatible with the changes made to it. Ethan nodded once. It was made to believe 2 different sets of instructions at the same time. A long pause followed. One of the senior engineers finally spoke. If that is true, why did no system alert ever trigger? Ethan closed the panel carefully. Because the alert system was also redirected during the second modification cycle. The words landed heavily. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. The realization was beginning to settle that what they had assumed was a mechanical failure might have been a structural misunderstanding. Victoria looked at the Ferrari again, then back at Ethan. Can you fix it? She asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back and studied the entire vehicle, as if seeing it for the first time and remembering it at the same time. Yes, he finally said, but not the way everyone has been trying. He reached for a small diagnostic connector and requested a direct power link from the maintenance station. A technician hesitated, then complied. As the cable connected, the Ferrari emitted a soft, internal activation sound, not a start, but a recognition. The system lights inside the dashboard flickered faintly, like a memory trying to surface. The room collectively leaned forward. Victoria's voice dropped slightly. What is happening? Ethan kept his eyes on the interface. The system is waking up to a configuration it has not seen in 5 years. He began entering a sequence slowly, not typing randomly, but following a logic pattern only he seemed to understand. The engineers watched the code scroll across the monitor. It was not complex in appearance. It was precise, controlled, familiar. Then suddenly, the dashboard display stabilized. A single line of system status appeared. Core architecture recognized. Ethan exhaled quietly. It is remembering what it was supposed to be. The silence in the room deepened. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Victoria Sterling, a woman known for controlling every environment she entered, stood completely still as the realization settled in that the man they had dismissed was not guessing. He had known exactly where to look from the beginning. The moment the system message appeared on the Ferrari dashboard, the entire showroom seemed to hold its breath. Core architecture recognized. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. Engineers leaned closer. Several employees instinctively stepped forward as if distance would change what they were seeing. Victoria Sterling did not move, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Ethan Brooks, who remained completely focused on the diagnostic interface. Ethan's fingers moved again, slow and precise, entering another sequence that appeared almost too simple compared to the complexity of the machine in front of him. You are not using a standard diagnostic protocol, one engineer said under his breath. Ethan replied without looking up. Standard protocols assume the system is functioning within expected boundaries. A few seconds passed. Then another line of text appeared on the screen. Secondary input layer conflict detected. A low murmur spread through the room. Ethan nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. There it is, he said calmly. Victoria finally stepped closer. What does that mean? Ethan paused his input for the first time. It means the car is not broken in the way everyone assumed. It is conflicted. He pointed gently at the interface. There are 2 active instruction sets running at the same time. One is factory original. One is modified. Neither has full authority. An engineer frowned. That is impossible. The system would default to emergency shutdown. Ethan shook his head. Not if someone intentionally disabled the fallback hierarchy during the second modification cycle. The room went silent again. The implication settled in slowly. Someone, somewhere in the chain of repairs, had not simply attempted to fix the Ferrari. They had altered its decision structure. Ethan returned to the interface. We are not repairing an engine, he continued. We are resolving a disagreement inside the system. He executed another command. The screen shifted. A detailed map of the vehicle's internal logic appeared, branching pathways lighting up across the display. One section glowed red. Another flickered yellow. Victoria watched closely. That red section was not there in our reports, she said. Ethan nodded. Because it was never accessible through your diagnostic path. A technician stepped forward. How did you access it? Ethan finally looked up. Because I am not following your path. The statement was not arrogant. It was factual. The room absorbed it differently. Ethan continued. This system does not need more replacement parts. It needs alignment. He initiated another sequence. The Ferrari responded immediately with a soft internal pulse. Not a roar. Not ignition. Recognition. The dashboard lights stabilized further, shifting from intermittent flicker to steady illumination. Then, for the first time in 5 years, the vehicle emitted a low, continuous operational hum. It was subtle, almost restrained, but unmistakably alive. Someone in the crowd exhaled sharply. Another whispered, "It is actually responding." Victoria raised a hand slightly, signaling silence without speaking. She watched as Ethan adjusted one final parameter. "Now we test coherence," he said quietly. The system ran a brief internal cycle. Every engineer in the room stared at the diagnostics as data streams synchronized in real time. The red section slowly faded to neutral. The yellow stabilized into green. The conflict indicators disappeared one by one. Then, a final message appeared, system harmonized. For several seconds, no one spoke. No one moved. The Ferrari sat perfectly still, yet everything about it felt different, as if it had been holding its breath for years and had finally exhaled. Victoria Sterling looked at the screen, then at the vehicle, then at Ethan Brooks. The confidence she carried into every room she entered was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. "You did not fix it," she said quietly. Ethan turned toward her. "No," he replied. "I let it become what it was supposed to be again." And in that moment, the entire showroom understood that what they had witnessed was not just a repair, but a correction of something they had never fully understood in the first place. The showroom remained completely silent after the system stabilized. The Ferrari stood under the bright white lights as if it had never been broken at all, its engine now resting in a calm, controlled state of readiness. The hum that had once been absent for 5 years was now steady, almost peaceful. No one spoke immediately. It was as if every person in the room was waiting for permission to believe what they had just seen. Victoria Sterling finally broke the silence. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Ethan Brooks stepped back from the vehicle and removed his hands from the interface. "I did not add anything," he said calmly. "I removed the conflict that should never have been created." A senior engineer stepped forward. "That system was evaluated by multiple international teams." Ethan nodded. "They evaluated symptoms, not structure." The engineer frowned. "Are you saying all of them were wrong?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the Ferrari as if listening to it one final time. "I am saying they were all solving the wrong problem." The words settled heavily across the room. Victoria studied him closely now, her expression no longer skeptical, but intensely focused. "How do you know this system so well?" she asked. For a moment, Ethan did not respond. The question lingered longer than expected. The engineers exchanged glances, sensing there was more behind the answer than simple technical knowledge. Ethan finally spoke. "Because I helped design systems like this before they were ever sold to the public." The room shifted instantly. A few heads turned sharply. Someone whispered under their breath. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "You worked in automotive engineering?" Ethan gave a small nod. "A long time ago." One of the senior engineers stepped forward again. "What company?" Ethan hesitated just long enough for the silence to deepen. "Ferraro Dynamics Research Division." The name landed like a quiet shockwave. Several engineers reacted immediately. They recognized it as one of the most exclusive performance engineering programs in the world, a division known for experimental vehicle systems and highly restricted access projects. Victoria's posture changed slightly. "That division was shut down over a decade ago." Ethan nodded again. "After the program ended, I left the industry." A long silence followed. The implication filled the room without anyone needing to say it aloud. The janitor they had dismissed was not an outsider stumbling into a problem. He He was someone who had once been part of building the very systems they now struggled to understand. Victoria walked slowly toward him, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. "You were one of them," she said. Ethan met her gaze calmly. "I was one of the people who believed complexity always meant progress." A faint tension passed through Victoria's expression. "And now?" she asked. Ethan looked back at the Ferrari. "Now I believe most problems are created when people forget to listen to what the system is already trying to say." No one interrupted. No one moved. Even the engineers who had been skeptical now stood in complete silence. The Ferrari remained steady, its systems aligned, its identity restored. Victoria finally exhaled slowly. 5 years, she said quietly. Millions of dollars. And the answer was someone we never even considered. Ethan shook his head slightly. "The answer was always here," he said. "It was just overlooked." For the first time since the challenge began, Victoria did not respond with authority or control. Instead, she simply looked at Ethan Brooks with something closer to understanding than evaluation. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to realize that what had just been repaired was not only a machine, but also their perception of who could solve impossible problems. The silence in the showroom did not break immediately. It lingered, heavy and thoughtful, as if the room itself needed time to accept what had just happened. The Ferrari now sat in perfect harmony, its system stabilized, its presence no longer that of a broken machine, but of something restored to its original clarity. Ethan Brooks stood a few feet away from it, his posture calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He did not look proud. He did not look surprised. He simply looked finished, as if he had completed something that had been waiting for him a long time. Victoria Sterling slowly stepped forward again, her eyes never leaving him. "You fixed it," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No," he replied. "I brought it back to itself." A faint ripple of confusion passed through the nearby engineers. One of them finally spoke. "That is still fixing it." Ethan turned slightly toward the group. "Fixing assumes something was broken," he said. "This was not broken. It was divided." The word landed with unusual weight. Victoria studied him more closely now, her expression no longer sharp but reflective. "You are not just a janitor," she said. Ethan gave a small, almost invisible smile. "I have not always been." A quiet pause followed. The engineers, once confident in their distance from him, now seemed uncertain where they stood. One of them finally asked, "If you were part of automotive engineering, why leave?" Ethan looked down briefly, as if considering how much of the answer to give. "Because systems like this are easy to understand," he said. "People are not." The room went still again. Victoria stepped even closer, now only a few feet away from him. "We spent 5 years trying to solve this," she said. "Millions of dollars. Teams from around the world. And you walked in and solved it in hours." Ethan shook his head once more. "You did not fail," he said. "You just never asked the right question." Victoria did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the Ferrari, then back at him. Something had changed in her expression. It was no longer ownership or pride. It was perspective. "What question should we have asked?" she finally said. Ethan turned toward the vehicle. "Not what is wrong," he said quietly, "but what changed?" A long silence followed. It was not uncomfortable anymore. It was reflective. One of the engineers lowered his head slightly, as if replaying years of assumptions in a single moment. Another quietly closed a tablet he had been holding for hours. Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had softened. "We offered you $1 million, she said. Ethan looked at her directly for the first time. "I did not do this for money," he replied. She nodded slowly. "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air longer than any before it. Ethan glanced toward the Ferrari, then beyond it, as if seeing something further than the room itself. "I want systems to stop being misunderstood," he said, "and people to stop being ignored because of what they look like." The words were simple, but they settled deeply into the room. Victoria remained silent for several seconds. Then she gave a slow nod. "That is not a request I hear often," she said quietly. Ethan returned his attention to the Ferrari one final time. The car remained perfectly still, but fully alive in a way it had not been for years. Around them, the showroom no longer felt like a stage for failure or success. It felt like a turning point. And as Victoria Sterling stood there looking at the man they had all underestimated, she realized something that no report, no engineer, and no 5-year investigation had ever revealed. The most complex systems in the room had never been the machines. They had been the assumptions built around the people who were never asked to speak. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.